The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the Wyoming territory, painting the endless prairie in shades of gold and amber. Dust devils danced in the distance, and the only sound was the rhythmic creak of leather and the soft thud of hooves on packed earth. Jake Morrison had been riding the same trail for 3 days, heading back to his small ranch outside Cheyenne. At 32, he was a man who'd learned to trust his instincts above all else, and right now, those instincts were telling him something was wrong. The figure ahead rode with perfect posture, but there was something unnatural about the stillness. No shifting in the saddle, no looking around at the landscape, just riding, as if the person was there, but not really present. Jake slowed his bay gelding, keeping his distance. In this territory, you learned to be cautious. Bandits, displaced settlers, and worse roamed these trails. But as he drew closer, he realized the rider was a young woman, maybe 20 or 21, with long auburn hair that caught the dying light. Her horse, a sturdy paint mare, was well cared for but showed signs of long travel. The woman's clothes were practical: a worn brown riding skirt, a simple white blouse, and a leather vest that had seen better days. But it was her face that stopped Jake cold. She stared straight ahead with eyes the color of storm clouds, but they held an emptiness that made Jake's chest tighten. Her lips were pressed together in a thin line, and there was something about the set of her jaw that spoke of pain held tightly in check. "Ma'am?" Jake called out, touching the brim of his hat. She turned her head slowly, those gray eyes meeting his. For a moment he saw a flicker of fear, then something else, resignation maybe. But she didn't speak, didn't even nod. Just looked at him with those haunted eyes before turning back to the trail ahead. Jake frowned. "You heading to Cheyenne?" Again, no response. The woman simply continued riding, her paint mare maintaining the same steady pace. Something was definitely wrong. A woman traveling alone out here was dangerous enough, but a woman who wouldn't or couldn't speak, that was a recipe for disaster. The wind picked up, carrying the scent of impending rain. Dark clouds were gathering on the horizon, and Jake knew from experience that Wyoming storms could turn violent fast. He made a decision that would change both their lives. "Storm's coming," he said, riding up alongside her. "There's a line shack about 2 miles ahead. You're welcome to shelter there." This time, she did look at him. Really looked. Her eyes searched his face for a long moment, and Jake found himself straightening under that scrutiny. He'd been told he had an honest face, but he'd never felt so thoroughly examined. Finally, she gave the slightest nod. They rode in silence as the first drops of rain began to fall. Jake found himself stealing glances at his mysterious companion. She sat her horse like she'd been born in the saddle, and her hands on the reins were steady and sure. Whatever had happened to her, it hadn't broken her spirit entirely. The line shack was a small, weathered building that served as emergency shelter for travelers and ranch hands. Jake dismounted and hurried to open the door, checking inside for any unwanted inhabitants, human or otherwise. Finding it empty, he turned back to help the woman down. She was already on the ground, tending to her horse with practiced efficiency. She stripped the saddle and bridle with smooth, economical movements, then began rubbing the mare down with a piece of burlap she'd produced from her saddlebags. "I'm Jake Morrison," he said, following her lead with his own horse. "I've got a ranch about 20 miles south of here." She paused in her rubbing, glancing at him again. Her mouth opened slightly as if she might speak, but then she closed it and went back to caring for her horse. Jake tried a different approach. "What's your name?" This time she shook her head, not in refusal, but in something that looked like confusion or pain. She touched her throat briefly, then dropped her hand as if it had burned her. Understanding dawned on Jake like a punch to the gut. She couldn't speak. Whether by choice or circumstance, this woman had no voice. Thunder rumbled overhead, and the rain began in earnest. Jake quickly finished with his horse and ushered both animals under the small lean-to attached to the shack. When he turned back, the woman was standing in the doorway watching him. "Come on in," he said gently. "It's dry, at least." The interior of the shack was sparse but functional. A stone fireplace, a rough wooden table, 2 chairs, and a narrow bunk. Jake busied himself building a fire while the woman stood near the door, seemingly ready to bolt at the first sign of trouble. As the flames caught and began to chase away the evening chill, Jake pulled out his supplies. "I've got coffee, hardtack, and some jerky. Not fancy, but it's hot." For the first time since he'd encountered her, the woman's expression softened slightly. She reached into her own saddlebags and produced a small cloth bundle. Inside were biscuits and what looked like dried fruit. "Looks like we both came prepared," Jake said with a small smile. She almost smiled back. Almost. They ate in silence, the only sounds the crackling fire and the steady drum of rain on the roof. Jake found himself fascinated by the way she moved, graceful and deliberate, as if every gesture was carefully considered. When she caught him watching, she didn't look away immediately. Instead, she tilted her head slightly, studying him with those penetrating grey eyes. "You're wondering what happened to me," Jake said quietly. She nodded once. "Fair enough. I'm wondering the same about you." This time her expression grew shuttered, and she looked away. "Don't worry," Jake added quickly. "I'm not going to press. A person's got a right to their secrets." The tension in her shoulders eased slightly, and when she looked back at him, there was something like gratitude in her eyes. Outside, the storm raged on, and Jake found himself oddly content. He'd always been a solitary man, had to be in his line of work. But there was something peaceful about sharing this small space with someone who didn't feel the need to fill every silence with chatter. As the evening wore on, Jake noticed the woman starting to nod off in her chair. "You take the bunk," he said. "I'll make do with the floor." She shook her head firmly and pointed to herself, then to the floor. "Ma'am, I wasn't raised to let a lady sleep on the ground while I took the bed." Her lips quirked up in what might have been amusement, and she shook her head again. This time, she mimed sleeping, sitting up in the chair. "Stubborn as a Missouri mule," Jake muttered, but there was no heat in it. He pulled a blanket from his pack and approached slowly, telegraphing his movements. She tensed, but didn't pull away as he draped it around her shoulders. "Get some rest," he said softly. "I'll keep the fire going." As Jake settled down with his back against the wall, he watched the woman's breathing gradually slow and deepen. Even in sleep, she held herself with a kind of guarded wariness that spoke of too many nights spent watching for danger. Whatever had brought her to this lonely trail, whatever had stolen her voice and put that haunted look in her eyes, Jake found himself hoping she'd find whatever she was looking for. And if he could help her find it, well, maybe that wouldn't be such a bad thing. The fire crackled lower, and the rain continued its steady rhythm on the roof. In the morning, they'd part ways. She'd continue on her mysterious journey, and he'd head home to his ranch and his solitary life. But something told Jake Morrison that this wasn't really the end of anything. It was just the beginning. 3 days later, Jake was mending fence on the northern boundary of his property when he saw the familiar paint mare picking its way down the rocky slope. His heart did an unexpected little skip as he recognized the slight figure in the saddle. She'd found him. Jake set down his tools and walked slowly toward the fence line, not wanting to spook her. The woman, he still didn't know her name, sat her horse at the edge of his property, watching him with those storm-gray eyes. "Morning," he said, touching his hat brim. She nodded in response, then looked past him toward his small ranch house and barn. Her gaze was assessing, but not in a way that made him uncomfortable. It was more like she was trying to understand what kind of man he was by looking at what he'd built. Jake followed her gaze, trying to see his place through her eyes. The house was modest but well-maintained, with a wide front porch and flower boxes his sister had insisted on during her last visit. The barn was sturdy, and his small herd of cattle grazed peacefully in the nearby pasture. It wasn't much, but it was honest work and an honest life. When he looked back, she was watching him again, and there was something almost like approval in her expression. "You're welcome to water your horse," Jake offered. "I was just about to break for lunch." For a long moment she didn't move. Then slowly she dismounted and led her mare toward the water trough near the barn. Jake watched her careful movements, noting how she constantly scanned her surroundings. Even here, on his peaceful ranch, she couldn't fully relax. Whatever had happened to her, it had left her expecting danger around every corner. "I'll just put some coffee on," he said, heading toward the house. By the time he emerged with 2 cups of coffee and a plate of leftover cornbread, she was sitting on the bottom step of his porch, her horse grazing nearby. She accepted the coffee with a small nod of thanks, wrapping her hands around the warm cup like it was precious. They sat in comfortable silence, watching the afternoon shadows lengthen across the yard. Jake found himself stealing glances at her profile, noting the determined set of her jaw and the way her eyes never stopped moving, cataloging every detail of her surroundings. "You're welcome to stay," he said eventually. "I've got a spare room, and it looks like more weather's moving in." She turned to look at him, and for a moment he saw longing in her eyes, a deep, aching need for safety, for rest, for a place where she didn't have to constantly watch over her shoulder. But then the guarded look returned, and she shook her head. Jake tried not to feel disappointed. "Well, the offer stands, always." She stood then, clearly preparing to leave, but something made her pause. Reaching into her saddlebag, she pulled out a small object wrapped in cloth. She hesitated for a moment, then placed it on the porch step between them. Inside the cloth was a carved wooden horse, no bigger than Jake's palm. The craftsmanship was exquisite. Every detail of the mane and muscles had been lovingly shaped and smoothed. It was the kind of thing a person carried because it meant something. "This is beautiful," Jake said softly, picking it up with careful hands. "Did you make this?" She shook her head and pointed to herself, then made a cradling motion with her arms. "Someone made it for you," Jake interpreted. "Someone important." She nodded, and there was a flicker of old pain in her eyes. Then she pointed to Jake and the little horse, clearly offering it to him. "I can't take this," Jake protested. "It's too precious." But she was already walking toward her horse, leaving the carving behind. She mounted with fluid grace, then looked back at him one more time. This time, when their eyes met, Jake saw something he hadn't expected: gratitude. Then she was riding away, leaving Jake standing on his porch with a wooden horse in his hands and more questions than answers. Over the next 2 weeks, she came back 4 more times, never staying long, just long enough to water her horse, accept a cup of coffee or a plate of food, and sit in that comfortable silence they'd developed. Jake began to look forward to these visits more than he cared to admit. He found himself listening for hoofbeats, watching the horizon for that familiar paint mare. On her 5th visit, she arrived just as a late spring thunderstorm was rolling in. This time, when Jake offered her shelter, she didn't refuse. They spent the evening in his small parlor, the fire crackling in the grate while rain lashed against the windows. Jake worked on repairing a bridle while she sat in the chair across from him, mending what looked like a torn shirt. "You're good with your hands," Jake observed, watching her neat, precise stitches. She glanced up at him, then down at her sewing. After a moment, she set the shirt aside and held up her hands, flexing her fingers. There were small scars on her palms and fingertips, the kind that came from years of careful, detailed work. "You're a seamstress," Jake guessed. She nodded, then made a motion like she was working at a larger piece of fabric. "A dressmaker?" Another nod, and this time there was a hint of pride in her expression. "That's skilled work," Jake said. "Takes patience and an eye for detail." For the first time since he'd known her, she smiled, really smiled. It transformed her entire face, chasing away the shadows and revealing the woman she might have been before whatever had happened to her. Jake felt his heart do that little skip again, and he had to look away before she noticed his reaction. When the storm passed and she prepared to leave the next morning, Jake made a decision. "There's something I want to show you," he said, leading her toward the barn. In the back corner, covered by an old tarp, was a sewing machine, a beautiful Singer model with intricate metalwork. Jake pulled away the covering, revealing the machine in all its glory. "It was my mother's," he explained. "She died when I was 16 and I couldn't bear to get rid of it, but I didn't know what to do with it either." The woman approached the machine like it was made of gold. Her fingers traced the decorative scrollwork, then tested the tension of the thread mechanism. When she looked up at Jake, her eyes were bright with unshed tears. "It's yours if you want it," Jake said. "I mean, if you ever decide to... if you want to stay somewhere for a while." She stepped back from the machine as if it had burned her, shaking her head firmly. But Jake could see the longing in her eyes. "I'm not trying to trap you," he said gently. "I'm just saying, if you ever want to stop running, there's a place for you here." She looked at him for a long moment and Jake held his breath. Then she touched his hand, just the briefest contact, but it sent warmth shooting up his arm. It was the first time she'd willingly touched another human being since he'd known her. She left that day, but the feeling of her fingers against his stayed with Jake long after she disappeared over the ridge. Jake was in town picking up supplies when he first heard the rumors. "Strange woman riding through these parts," Tom Bradley, the general store owner, was saying to another customer. "Red hair, riding alone. Sheriff thinks she might be connected to those robberies up in Colorado." Jake's blood went cold. "What robberies?" Tom leaned across the counter, lowering his voice conspiratorially. "Stage robberies mostly, but there was a bank job too. Thing is, witnesses say there was a woman involved, couldn't or wouldn't talk, used hand signals to communicate with the gang. That's a pretty thin connection," Jake said carefully. "Maybe so, but Sheriff Williams is asking questions, wants to talk to anyone who's seen her." Jake finished his business as quickly as possible and headed home, his mind racing. He knew with absolute certainty that the woman, his woman, he realized with a start, wasn't a criminal. Everything about her spoke of gentleness, of someone who'd been hurt, not someone who hurt others. But he also knew how these things worked. A mysterious woman who couldn't speak, traveling alone through territory where crimes had been committed. In the minds of men like Sheriff Williams, that was as good as a confession. He had to warn her. Jake spent the next 3 days riding his property's borders, hoping to catch sight of her. On the 4th day, just as despair was setting in, he saw smoke rising from the direction of the old line shack where they'd first taken shelter. He found her there, sitting by a small fire with her horse grazing nearby. But the moment she saw him approaching, Jake knew something was wrong. She was on her feet instantly, every muscle tense, ready to run. "It's okay," Jake called out, dismounting slowly. "It's just me." But her grey eyes were wild with something that looked like panic, and she was already reaching for her horse's reins. "Wait," Jake said urgently. "There's something you need to know. There are men looking for you." She froze, her face going pale. "The sheriff thinks you might be connected to some robberies up in Colorado. I know it's not true, but..." He didn't get to finish. She was in the saddle and riding hard before he could say another word, leaving Jake standing alone by the dying fire. For 3 weeks, there was no sign of her. Jake found himself riding out further and further each day, searching every gulch and valley, but she'd vanished as completely as if she'd never existed. The only proof she'd been real was the wooden horse she'd given him, which he kept on his mantle like a talisman. Then, on a cold morning in early June, Jake woke to find his barn door standing open. Heart-pounding, he grabbed his rifle and approached cautiously. Rustlers weren't uncommon in these parts, and a man couldn't be too careful. But instead of thieves, he found her. She was slumped against one of the stalls, her horse standing protectively nearby. Even in the dim light, Jake could see she was hurt. Her shirt was torn, and there was dried blood on her sleeve. "Jesus," Jake breathed, setting down his rifle and rushing to her side. She tried to pull away when he reached for her, but she was too weak to resist effectively. Up close, Jake could see she was exhausted and dehydrated, her lips cracked and her skin pale. "What happened to you?" he asked gently, helping her to her feet. She gestured vaguely toward the north, then made a motion like someone grabbing at her. Her meaning was clear enough. Someone had tried to take her, and she'd fought her way free. "Come on," Jake said. supporting her weight as they walked toward the house. "Let's get you cleaned up." In his kitchen, Jake heated water and gathered clean cloth while she sat at his table, swaying slightly with exhaustion. When he turned back to her, she was watching him with those storm-gray eyes, and there was something different in them now. Trust. Real, complete trust. "This is going to sting," Jake warned, approaching with the wet cloth. She nodded and pulled up her sleeve, revealing a nasty gash on her forearm. It was clean but deep, and Jake could see it needed stitching. "I'm going to have to," he began, but she was already reaching into her saddlebag. She pulled out a small sewing kit and handed it to him, then gripped the edge of the table with her good hand. Jake had sewn up his share of cuts over the years, but never on skin so soft, never on someone who mattered so much. His hands were steady as he worked, but inside, his heart was hammering. She never made a sound, just gripped the table until her knuckles went white. When he finished, Jake bandaged the wound carefully, then looked up to find her watching him with an expression that made his breath catch. "You came back," he said softly. She nodded, then did something that stopped Jake's heart altogether. She reached up and touched his face, her palm cool against his cheek. For a moment, they stayed like that, her hand on his face, his hand still gentle on her bandaged arm. The morning light slanted through the kitchen window, painting everything in gold, and Jake thought he'd never seen anything more beautiful than this woman who'd trusted him with her pain. Then she was pulling away, color rising in her cheeks, and the moment was broken. But something had changed between them, something that couldn't be taken back. That night, she slept in his spare room, the first time she'd stayed overnight in his house. Jake lay awake, listening to the soft sounds of her moving around, marveling at how right it felt to have her there. In the morning, over coffee and eggs, Jake made a decision. "I'm going to town today," he said, "to talk to Sheriff Williams." Her head snapped up, and she shook it frantically. "Not about you," Jake said quickly, "about the real robbers. There's something not right about this whole thing, and I intend to find out what." She grabbed his arm, her grip surprisingly strong, and shook her head again. Her meaning was clear. It was too dangerous. "Maybe," Jake said, covering her hand with his. "But I can't sit by and let them hunt you for something you didn't do. I won't." For a long moment they looked at each other across the breakfast table. Then, slowly, she nodded. She understood what he was offering, not just his help, but his protection, his faith in her innocence. She was trusting him with more than her life now. She was trusting him with her future. Sheriff Williams was a big man with suspicious eyes and a mustache that had seen better days. He leaned back in his chair as Jake laid out his theory, occasionally grunting or shaking his head. "So you're telling me," the sheriff said when Jake finished, "that this mysterious woman everyone's been talking about is innocent and the real robbers are still out there?" "That's exactly what I'm telling you," Jake replied. "And I think if you dig a little deeper into those robberies, you'll find they all happened on dates when she was nowhere near Colorado." "And you know this how?" Jake had anticipated this question. "Because she's been staying on my ranch, has been for weeks." The sheriff's eyebrows shot up. "You harboring a fugitive, Morrison." "I'm harboring an innocent woman who's been wrongly accused," Jake said firmly, "and I'll stake my reputation on it." It took 2 more hours of arguing, but finally Sheriff Williams agreed to send a telegram to the Colorado authorities, requesting more details about the robberies. Jake left the jail, feeling cautiously optimistic, but he knew the real test would come when he got home. He found her in the barn, working with his mother's sewing machine. She'd somehow managed to get it running smoothly, and she was working on what looked like a shirt. His shirt, Jake realized, one that had torn beyond his ability to repair. She looked up when he entered, and the question in her eyes was clear. "Williams is going to look into it," Jake said. "It'll take time, but I think we can prove your innocence." Relief flooded her face, but then something else replaced it. Fear. Jake understood. Once her name was cleared, what reason would she have to stay? They'd never talked about the future, never made any promises. For all he knew, she had a life somewhere else, people who were waiting for her. The thought of losing her now, when he'd just found her, was almost unbearable. That evening, they sat on his front porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink. The wooden horse she'd given him sat on the small table between them. Jake had taken to bringing it outside in the evenings, a tangible reminder of the trust she'd placed in him. "Can I ask you something?" Jake said finally. She turned to look at him, nodding. "That first night in the line shack, you could have kept riding, could have found shelter somewhere else. Why did you trust me?" She was quiet for so long that Jake thought she might not answer. Then she stood and walked to the edge of the porch, looking out over the land that had become as familiar to her as it was to him. When she turned back, there was something different in her face, a kind of resolve that Jake had never seen before. She walked back to him and took his hands in hers. Then, slowly, deliberately, she opened her mouth and spoke. "Because," she said, her voice rusty from disuse but clear as a bell, "you were the first person who didn't try to make me talk." Jake's heart stopped. Her voice was everything he'd imagined, soft and musical, with just a hint of an accent he couldn't place. "You can speak," he breathed. She nodded, tears starting to slide down her cheeks. "I could always speak. I couldn't. Not after." She stopped, swallowing hard. Jake waited, not pushing, just holding her hands and letting her find her words. "My name is Sarah," she continued, her voice growing stronger. "Sarah Catherine Mills. I was engaged to a man in Denver, a good man, or so I thought. But 3 days before our wedding, I found out he was involved with a gang of thieves. When I confronted him, She touched her throat and Jake understood. "He hurt you. He tried to strangle me," Sarah whispered. "Said if I ever told anyone what I knew, he'd finish the job. So I ran. I took my horse and I ran, and I couldn't speak for months afterward. Every time I tried, I could feel his hands around my throat." Jake's jaw clenched with fury, but he kept his voice gentle. "What was his name?" "Marcus Whitman. He's handsome and charming, and everyone in Denver thinks he's a pillar of the community. But he's the one behind those robberies, Jake. He's the one they should be looking for." "We'll tell Williams," Jake said firmly. "We'll make sure." "Jake," Sarah's hands tightened on his. "There's something else. The reason I kept coming back here, the reason I couldn't stay away." She took a shaky breath. "I think I'm falling in love with you." The world seemed to stop. Jake stared into those storm-gray eyes, seeing everything he'd hoped for and more. "Sarah," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "I know it's crazy," she rushed on. "I know I bring nothing but trouble, and you deserve better than—" He silenced her with a kiss, soft and sweet and full of all the words he couldn't say. When they finally broke apart, Sarah was crying harder, but she was smiling too. "I love you too," Jake said against her forehead. "I think I have since that first night when you trusted me enough to share that little shack with a complete stranger." "You're not a stranger," Sarah whispered. "You're home." 3 months later, Sheriff Williams rode out to the ranch with news that Marcus Whitman had been arrested in connection with the Colorado robberies. Sarah's testimony, combined with evidence the authorities had gathered, was enough to put him away for a long time. "You're free to go wherever you want now, Miss Mills," Williams said. "Clear as new snow." Sarah looked at Jake, and he saw his whole future in her eyes. "I'm already where I want to be, Sheriff," she said, her voice clear and strong. "I'm home." That evening, as they sat on their porch, because it was theirs now, officially and completely, Sarah picked up the wooden horse from the table. "My father carved this for me," she said, running her thumb over the smooth surface. "Before he died, when I was just a little girl, it was supposed to remind me that I was strong enough to carry myself anywhere I needed to go." "And did it work?" Jake asked, pulling her closer. Sarah smiled, that radiant smile that never failed to take his breath away. "It brought me to you, didn't it? You." Jake looked out over the land they'd build their life on, where their children would play and grow, where they'd grow old together. The wooden horse sat between them, a symbol of the journey that had brought them together. "I guess it did," he said, pressing a kiss to her temple. "I guess it did. Sit." In the distance, a mockingbird began its evening song, and Sarah hummed along softly, the first time Jake had ever heard her sing. Her voice rose and fell with the bird's melody, a sound more beautiful than anything he'd ever heard. She had found her voice again, and in doing so, she had found her way home.